So I'm in the studio today with my friends Rahul Attraya, Kyle Vansice, and Nate Peters, co-founders of Cedar, a venture-backed platform for residential construction that addresses the complexities around infill development and dramatically reduces the time it takes to go from land acquisition to permitting. This web-based explorer simplifies property search, site analysis, zoning, code compliance, and financial modeling. And based on this, suggests design options for your site. You can go to cedar.build to test it out. So that's a very long description of what Cedar does. So if I understand correctly, it's a database of land here in Austin that helps developers understand the availability of land, what type of property sits on the land, what's the cost, and what type of property can be built on the land, correct?
Yeah.
Anything else you would add to that?
Well, I mean, put more simply, we're putting housing in a feedback loop with zoning policy, right? So if I'm a developer and I've got a number of options that I'm studying in terms of deal acquisition and where I want to build and how much I want to build, the first question I have to answer is, what am I going to build? And you have to look to the zoning code for that answer.
What's the zoning code?
So the zoning code is a set of regulations.
Yeah.
It's a universal set of regulations across a city. Every city has one except for Houston, as we know.
Why?
We can get into that in a second, but every city has a zoning code, and this is basically the rules and regulations around land development. What can be built on a site, commercial, residential, retail, what the density is of that site or can be of that site, and then incentives and bonuses that allow you to increase the density or change the use of that site based on things that you may do as a developer on behalf of the public interest. So providing additional parking spots or providing public space, these sorts of things, providing affordable housing, affordable units. These sorts of things can allow you to build with additional density, and in doing so, as a developer, you have a greater opportunity to maximize the development potential of your site.
So who determines what can be built where in the city? Is it the city council? Who is the person that determines?
In short, democracy. Right? So there's a few different boards. There's a zoning and approval board. There's a city council. There's also a planning and development department, and they differ across different cities, of course. But fundamentally, there's an elected group of folks. City council is one of them, and they help build out another group of people who are considered experts, right? They are architects or land development planners or attorneys, and they work on behalf of the city to kind of mediate between the city council and the interests of the city to determine, again, how the city is laid out, right? This is an urban planning question. Zoning is fundamentally urban planning. So it's kind of a messy process, but these different stakeholder groups get together and they work out where different parts of the city are zoned in terms of a base zoning, and then different types of overlays to the city that would increase or change potential uses.
So when you look at student housing, we are in West Campus now. There's been a huge increase in students into Austin, and that requires new housing supply, right? I think before this Waterloo Tower here, there was just a regular one-story house, and they had to go and get permission to build a 30-story building in West Campus. So if I'm a developer, I go to the city council to get the permission to build a skyscraper here, or how does it work? How do I identify the land where I can build what I want to build based on the demand?
Yeah, it's a complicated answer. So again, there's kind of what's called by right zoning, and that is what the city council, in collaboration with the zoning and approvals department and land planning department, have determined. What you have on top of that are what are called PUDs. So there's a planned use development, and so a developer, in collaboration with community organizations in the city, can propose an upzoned district, right? But in order to propose such a district and have it approved, there need to be trade-offs on behalf of the public. So again, public parks, affordable housing units, these sorts of things. So you're working with this kind of representative democratic organization, right, to basically mediate a solution for development, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So increase density for residential, but you may hold a certain number of those units to affordable requirements.
But the likelihood of those variances depends on what neighborhood you're in.
Yeah.
Obviously, being in West Campus and a high demand for student housing, you're more likely to get that variance passed. But let's say you were in Westlake Hills or, take any other single family neighborhood, you will have opposition from neighborhood associations or homeowners associations to increasing density, which again adds additional complexity to an already complicated process.
So you're simplifying the process of finding the land and identifying what could be built on it for developers.
Yeah, I mean, quite simply put, it's just helping them understand, as Kyle was saying, like, what can I build and how much of that what can I build on this land.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cedar's not going to fix zoning policy by any means. But what we are...
Are you a lobbyer as well on the side, or?
No. I mean, we're definitely working with organizations on certain subjects that are potentially interesting to the development community. Parking minimums is a big one. Also, the way that property is rezoned or upzoned. There's a lot going on in the city council and the planning department right now around rethinking that process so that it's easier for more affordable housing typologies or unit types to get passed. But we're creating a translation layer or a feedback loop with that zoning policy to developers or for developers so that they can much more quickly navigate all of those rules and requirements and understand them in a way that results in development potential, which is just the number of units, the total gross area, all of these sort of dimensions and quantities that are associated with the actual physical form of a development.
You mentioned parking. There's definitely a lack of parking spaces in Austin.
You said lack of parking?
Lack of parking spaces. I mean, you said that you couldn't find a parking space around here.
Well, it depends on where you are, right? If you're
in downtown Austin,
sure.
or around downtown, it's very difficult. So how do you fix it? How would you fix this problem?
It depends on how you classify the problem, right? Is the problem that we don't have enough parking spots?
Yeah. Or
is it the problem that we've built a car-centric city?
Right. That's a good point.
So, developers and planners, the city itself, everyone has to come together to determine what kind of city we want to live in. And that qualitative distinction makes its way into quantitative rules and regulations throughout. So, for example, with parking, you may say we don't have enough parking spots, but a developer may say, well, it's really hard for me to build affordable housing or obtainable housing when parking minimums are 1 to 2 per unit, because I have to build parking structures, and these parking structures are expensive and they're additional space. Like if I could only build a building with residential units, that's much cheaper than if I have to build a residential building with those units plus parking structure.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And there are a whole host of other kind of second order effects associated with having lots of parking, right? The streetscape isn't as walkable, livable, pedestrian friendly. That has an impact on property values. It also has an impact on the retail environment and the commercial value of that neighborhood. When we say it's hard to find a parking spot, that's an immediate need, right? But we need to think farther, right? We need to think, in sort of longer, across longer dimensions, right? We need to think about the kinds of residential environments that we want to live in.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know that doesn't solve traffic and congestion, but when you start to answer those questions, you start to answer other questions around public transport. And, there's something we talk about a lot is, once we start to see more and more autonomous vehicles, the utilization of cars dramatically increases, and we need a lot less space in the city for roadways.
I'm all for public transport, but if you look at America, I think most cities in America are car-centered, except for New York or Chicago or all these large cities. And it's very difficult for people like myself without a car to get around because the public transport is non-existent. Especially here in Austin, you have buses going vertically and then buses going horizontally, and that's pretty much it. If you look at London, which is where I come from, right, the public transport is just amazing. The tube goes every minute, there's buses everywhere. It's just, it's a city where you really don't need a car and you shouldn't have a car. So do you think we should transform cities in America to the likes of London, Paris? Do you think we should have a tube in Austin, or?
We get in trouble here, but.
Well, I mean, again, America as a whole, almost 70%, if not more, is zoned for a single family. And this really goes back to the post-war era where these soldiers were coming back and America as a whole decided that it was, time to allow for more single-family homes to be built, where everyone can own their own yard, own, home on a piece of land rather than stacking everyone on top, which has now led to this problem of most cities around America becoming car-centric, right? In Austin, for example, most people that work in downtown have to get in their car in the morning, drive 45 minutes either way just to get to work, and do that again once they're done at 5 o'clock, right? And that, it's not an easy problem to solve because there's already zoning regulations in place here that has made it difficult to solve problems like that. But if we go back to
what kind of regulation, for example?
Again, just having the cities be more focused on single-family homes, like Austin, for example, like almost 70-80% is zoned for
single-family homes.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing they did is they zoned the city and kind of crafted the rules in a way that protected the idea of single-family homes being the standard. So when the city was zoned, they then layered on this thing they call compatibility requirements, which in Austin are extremely kind of overbearing compared to the way that most cities operate, which is why Austin has, we would say, a dramatically worse problem than most cities. Mm-hmm. And so in Austin specifically, the way that it works is that if you have, look at a map and find a single-family home, you draw a 540 foot circle around the center of the home, and it limits the size of every other building that you could build within that circle. So it creates kind of like an umbrella effect. But then that rule applies to every single home. So you essentially can kind of create if you take a map of the city and some trace paper, you sort of create this exclusion zone where you can build things that are denser than single family homes. So it's almost, from a zoning perspective, it kind of creates this almost virus where as you build more homes like this, it then expands the area that you can't build things that aren't single family homes. And so unwinding that problem is super, super hard, which is why places like LA, Austin, mm-hmm. Denver, that kind of maximized the suburban experiment. Now, in the 2020s, we've kind of hit the limit of how far that can go. Now, the edge of the city is now 4 times further than it was in the 60s. And so it doesn't, the dream of living in the suburbs and commuting downtown just doesn't work anymore because of physics. In transit, you just can't get that far in a single day. And so now there needs to be, even if theoretically you could just throw London-style transit system underground in Austin, which you really can, that doesn't really kind of solve the underlying problem, which is you need to rethink how you lay out large groups of people and how you densify them in a way that doesn't require cars. And so it's a much more kind of meta problem, or
mm-hmm.
much more kind of high-level, society-level issue that people are very, very slowly chipping away at.
And these zoning regulations aren't only restricting how much you can build horizontally, meaning how wide or how deep can you build a house on a lot. They also restrict in terms of vertically, right? How tall can you build? So inherently, the only way you can build more housing is to just sprawl, just continue to build outwards, and which is why every major American city has just this indefinite sprawl of urban suburbs.
So cities have a choice, right? We build out or we build up.
Yeah.
And that simple choice defines the kinds of streetscapes and the communities that we live in, the way we get around, even the types of jobs that we have, and the way we raise our children, right? That simple question. And a lot of the answer to that question is embedded in the zoning code. And so it's one of those things that has a huge impact on your life, but you don't think about it. And it's, quite banal, quite boring, right? The zoning code, who would have thought?
Yeah.
But it has probably one of the biggest impacts on your life that you're not thinking about.
Yeah. It's interesting to compare this single-family home culture in America to my country, which is Czech Republic, which used to be under the communist regime. We have a bunch of, what is it called, these panel houses, like 15, 20-story high, same structure, same design, ugly buildings. And like 50% of our cities are these panel houses where people live. Yeah. And it's super ugly, but it's very efficient, right? Like there's no traffic. Most cities are very easy to get through. People live in dense areas. So yeah, I could see the downsides and the upsides of both.
But these homes, these types of homes, right? They often sit somewhat independent, right? They're sort of these, and correct me if I'm wrong, but our conception of these homes, or at least the way that we've seen them, typically sort of like Courvoisier type, like socialist housing blocks, right?
Yeah.
Are in parks, right? They're sort of the socialist housing block in the park. And they're not really woven into the city fabric.
Well, it depends. I think there's Czech Republic actually has the largest panel house complex, which houses 70,000 people, I believe. And it's in the city of Kladno. 70,000 people in a huge panel block. It's crazy.
But what are the streetscapes like?
I have no idea. I haven't been there.
Yeah. I mean, we work with a lot of single-family home developers, and their goal really is to build great projects that people want to live in, and they want to max out the development potential of the properties they're working on.
Yeah.
It's not that anyone wants to build single-family homes because philosophically or ideologically they're inclined to do so. It's because that's what the city allows, right? And so we want to work with those developers to, as the city grows and evolves, which we're seeing now in Austin, right? Austin is moving towards more multifamily projects and towards denser neighborhoods, more walkable and livable neighborhoods. These developers are partners, and if anything, the United States needs more residential developers taking risk, building homes, and interfacing with complex rules and regulations, regulatory capture, in order to, get the supply of housing up. The U.S. has a real crisis in terms of housing supply.
So why did you choose Austin and not California? I think California is the number one state with the most discrepancy between housing supply and demand.
A lot of reasons. As a startup, there's a huge over-focus on California. And none of us, I live there now, but none of us are from there or grew up there. And the problem that we're interested in actually exists in almost every major city in the United States, not California exclusively. It is worse there, and there are startups, somewhat similar to us, looking at problems like this in California. But there's also a lot of reasons to not be there. It's really, really, it's overregulated in a different way. And we think it's interesting to try to solve the problem in a place that more mimics the rest of the United States in terms of like the regulatory environment and the way that the housing market operates. Because Austin, very recently kind of encountered this problem. California's been sort of building up this issue over a much longer period of time. They've been passing laws, sort of tweaking the system, changing the parameters, and there's just a different kind of complexity there. And it was something we just sort of felt obvious to us that we would try to solve the problem, or kind of like enter the market somewhere that wasn't, where we saw a huge issue but didn't see a lot of people really spending the time thinking about it.
So from a regulatory perspective, how does California differ from Texas?
In terms of a housing supply shortage, it's the same at a very high level. They're not building enough houses, more people are moving there, people that have lived there for a long time are getting priced out of the market because companies come in, pay their employees a bunch, housing prices go up. That's all kind of the standard recipe for a housing shortage. In California, there's a lot more environmental bureaucracy, there's kind of different mechanisms by which it's difficult for developers to build housing. Projects can take a super long time and get kind of blocked up at parts in the process that wouldn't necessarily happen for the same reasons in other places.
Why is that? Why do they get blocked up?
It's just the way the California government operates. It's by the ocean. There's lots and lots of environmental laws.
Gus bureaucracy.
Yeah, lots of bureaucracy. And it exists in different forms everywhere. And so, I think the problem we're encountering here is probably 80% the same as California, but we're able in Austin to kind of focus more on like the pure kind of the loop between regulation, developers, and the market in a cleaner way. And then California is sort of the next challenge for us, where we'll kind of bring in this like extra set of regulations that are very unique to California. But the rules and the sort of the core issue in Austin looks a lot more like the issue you see in Atlanta or Portland or Seattle or kind of any other city about the same size as Austin.
Additionally, the partnerships here in Austin kind of also attracted us to the city. There's a community and an ecosystem really of supporting startups like us to solve big problems. Initially, when we started Cedar, we thought the solution to solving the housing crisis is to really productize housing, kind of like the prefabricated startups that you're seeing pop up in a lot of different places. But again, speaking to a lot of big stakeholders and experts in the city, the community kind of almost drug us to build the version of Cedar that we're building now, which is, physically building the houses are a challenge. And there are a lot of experts and professionals doing that here in Austin. But understanding the complexities and the bureaucracies of getting a house built is a much bigger problem. And given our backgrounds and the ability to build a platform like Cedar could help these experts that are building the homes get those homes built faster.
So in order to make Cedar work, as you said, you need relationships with all these stakeholders. Right. You said this week you were meeting with the Home Builders Association. What are they telling you? Like, what needs to be done? How do they feel about the situation here in Austin?
Yeah, I mean, these are people who've been building homes for, in that room, 20.
So Home Builders Association is developers? Or what is it made of?
Home builders.
Home builders.
But at the smaller residential scale, say, 2 to 3 units on a site, home builders and developers can be synonymous. They can be the same. Not always, but there's so much overlap there that it's hard to tell the difference sometimes. But home builders, they know everything about the process. If they're not developing the project, they could. And they're experts, right? I mean, these are people that are taking really large risks, and they are going everywhere from large scale financing or kind of 10,000 foot scale financing all the way down to what is the weight of nails to properly use when stud framing, and they just have an incredible breadth of knowledge. So we're not going to go in there and do their job for them by any means, right? What we are trying to do is give them data and give them access to the data that the city of Austin is collecting, but is not necessarily making as accessible and actionable as it could be. The city of Austin is very progressive in its ability to capture data, collect and store it and make it available across different platforms, but it's not putting it in one place. And so Cedar is putting it in one place.
So part of your product is also data analysis.
Yeah. There's sort of data collection, which is kind of unstructured data, right? And then we structure that data so that it's 3-dimensionalized. You can see it on a map. You can see it on your site. You can visually see easements and trees and erosion control hazard zones and floodplains. All of these things that get in the way of building a home, right? Or constraints on building a home. So we structure that data. We make it visible. And then we also show you design options, initial design options, which kind of optimize the placement and maximize the development potential or the total gross area that you can build on that site.
To understand this concept, maybe it's important to talk about how what that process looks like currently as it stands pre-Cedar. Let's say I'm a developer working a 2-3 unit project, or maybe 15-20, the smaller scale developer. The process currently is I have a deal that comes to my table. One of my scout or a broker sends me a deal, says, here's a property, great development potential.
How do you identify the deal?
There's different sources that these deals.
Is it all about relationships? If I'm a scout,
yeah,
do I just go around and talk to people?
Yeah, exactly. There's different routes. Literally, you have scouts that are driving around the city in their cars, looking at properties, and then brokers are sending them deals like, hey, this off-market property looks like a great investment opportunity. You can put 2 units here. About that much information. That's about what they'll give you. And then it's up to you to go to the site and kind of walk the site and maybe look at, okay, trees are a big deal here in Austin. If a tree's over a certain diameter, the trunk diameter, you cannot cut it down, right? Because it qualifies as a protected or a heritage tree. But that's it, right? And then if you were to know anything beyond the risks involved, if there's an erosion hazard zone or any kind of easement, you would have to reach out to an architect or a civil engineer or another design professional that can provide you with that information, and that takes about 2-3 weeks. And at a larger scale, let's say 15-20 unit project, that could take 3 months and cost you, I don't know, upwards of $30,000-$40,000. That's a pretty long-term process, right? But all I need to know as a developer, is it a good decision for me to go or get a no-go decision on that project. And essentially, we're just trying to compile all of that data that you need to get to that go, no-go decision and get you that information with a couple quick clicks.
What does the competition look like here in Austin? Like, is there a bunch of developers that are competing for a limited number of properties that could be built on?
Yeah, in every market.
Every market.
There's entire, coalitions of developers that organize themselves in professional groups. So there's Austin Infill Coalition, which is people that specifically work on building housing within the city limits. So one kind of big distinction within housing.
What's the Austin city limit?
Essentially, it's the kind of invisible boundary on the map where the Austin zoning code is applied to properties or to parcels. So there, it evolves and changes, and it's
like specifically which area does it include?
Oh, it's probably hard to describe without a map.
How many miles radius?
I mean, how long is the coast of England?
Yeah,
right?
It's sort of like
it depends on what ruler you're using.
Okay.
But it's constantly evolving, right? And as the city incorporates and creates new kind of developments, it changes.
Mm-hmm.
I guess like an easy way to think about it is, in a really vague sense, it extends to the edges of where like the address of a property is Austin. So if you go far north enough to where it's like Pflugerville, Texas, it's the suburbs of Austin. That's not.
Is it?
That's not within the jurisdiction of Austin.
Okay.
That's not Austin
Right.
city limits. That has its own zoning codes, its own rules.
Yeah.
And usually they're just a couple of pages long.
Yeah, and they're like radically simpler than what Austin has.
There are addresses within Austin, like Westlake Hills, maybe Sunset Valley, that have their own jurisdiction. And again, if for some reason if Austin decides that they would benefit from having Austin's jurisdiction, I don't know why, because I'm sure those jurisdictions have much simpler zoning laws. Austin would then go and acquire or apply their zoning laws onto those jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm.
But to your original question, it's an inherently competitive market. So everyone, in the housing development world, in some sense, is there to make money. Is their business. They're looking to acquire properties, tear them down, remodel them, do something to them to increase the value of them, and then sell them back to the market for a profit. And that's how their business operates. So when, like Rahul said, when these deals come up as an opportunity, it's very rarely going to one person. Multiple people are going to know about this and are going to be looking at it simultaneously. And so speed is super important. Like there's whoever essentially is able to analyze it faster or is willing to accept more risk by not going as deep in the analysis is going to have the advantage and is going to be able to move faster. And so there's always this like really kind of difficult trade-off between like how quickly can I move versus how far can I go into kind of checking my math in a sense before going ahead and putting the money down.
So speed is important, and the accuracy of making that decision is also important, right? Like you're investing in a multi-million-dollar property. You want to make sure that what you think you can build, you can actually build that on that property.
What's the average property price of a single-family home in Austin? Would you know?
That varies by zip code.
Yeah, I mean it's somewhere between $500 and $600 a square foot. That's kind of where we're operating now.
That's
not
crazy.
over $1 million, but probably somewhere in the $600,000 or $700,000 range right now.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the market price. It varies extremely rapidly, and over the last 5 years, the rate at which it varies has gotten a lot faster.
Mm-hmm. So if I acquire land that has a single family home on it, can I just tear it down? Or is there any restrictions as to...
Is it 40 years old or not?
I don't know. I mean, in London, right, there are very strict restrictions as to what you can and cannot do with properties. So how does it work in Austin?
With an existing property, if you were trying to tear it down, the first question you have to ask is it 40 years, as Kyle was saying, 40 years old? If it is, then you have to go through a historic review process. And
so if it's older than 40 years, you have to ask special permission.
Yeah,
that kind of doesn't make sense. It should be the opposite. Like if it's younger than 40 years, then that building is more like sustainable and right.
Well, this is where democracy comes in, right? Because the city of Austin has a history, right? And that history spans a certain time dimension, right? Time domain. And, the city has determined, the citizens of the city, right, have determined that there was a time at which Austin looked a certain way and we want to preserve that.
Yeah.
And in order to do so, we need to make sure that any homes that are older than this time domain or fit within this time domain are evaluated for their historical value.
I imagine like 1980s, what did Austin look like? What was like the Capitol was here and then just single family homes.
And UT, right?
UT was here, right? Interesting. So when we talked about competition, I found a startup called Samara that was recently founded by Gebbia. And I think you're operating in a similar space. So they're a startup in the residential construction space in California, which helps homeowners build tiny houses in their backyards.
Yes, this is the kind of like industry term, or I guess like the buzzword for that is called an ADU. So it's an accessory dwelling unit. In simpler terms, it's a backyard home. Could be called a granny flat, could be called a secondary home, but essentially it's a house that goes in the backyard of a bigger house.
And it's factory produced.
It's factory produced. They're built in a completely different way than homes typically are in every possible sense. A home that you would see pop up in Austin with about 99% certainty was probably built on site out of 2x4s by a team of kind of traditional tradespeople that are going to go in and build a house kind of the way you imagine one would. With an ADU, and there's a company called Cover that does something very similar. There's many companies like Samara popping up. There's dozens, and that's another huge kind of subset of really interesting problems that people are solving within the housing crisis, and that's purely at the production side.
Yeah.
What is not in Samara's scope, unless they've kind of expanded it without our knowledge, is that it isn't their job to tell you if you're allowed to do that there. If you have a house in California, you might be within their service radius. They might be able to deliver a house to your address, but that doesn't interact at all with the city rules, the regulations, the building permits, the noise regulations. You might need permission from your neighbors. You might have an HOA. You might be within a protected historic district. There's dozens of reasons why you aren't allowed to do that.
Yeah, that was my other question, right? Like, even if it's my backyard, there are still restrictions as to what I can do with that backyard.
Yeah, and the way California defines ADUs or this backyard homes is very different than how Austin defines it, and it's different than how most other cities define it, right? In California, it is truly a backyard home. It's a guest house, maybe a studio for you to go work in. Versus in Austin, it's actually someone's house. It's much larger.
1,100 square feet.
1,100 square feet is typically what
a lot.
So it's, two and a half bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms typically. So
why is that an ADU then?
That's just how Austin terms it.
Yeah. I mean,
what's their logic behind that?
Maybe back up. Let's be a little polemical here, since this is a podcast.
Yeah.
Let's get it.
It's all about honesty.
So when we talk about the housing crisis, right? Like people start throwing out different ways in which, or different solutions, right? And ADU is often a solution, right? And we think big fans of Gebbia, big fans of Samara, really beautiful product. But we're sort of looking at the city urbanistically, at the macro scale, and we're trying to understand, what are the various options available on a site, not just a backyard home, right? Not just an ADU. There are, as the zoning code evolves, the options that you can build evolve as well, and that optionality creates diversity in the residential built environment. And so ADUs are one solution, but Cedar's really trying to look at the sort of combination of many options and how can you find the best one,
Mm-hmm.
and how can you find the one that maximizes density? Because ultimately, Cedar, we believe, we're trained architects, planners, we believe in density, walkability, livability, and so
maybe you could work with Samara to help them identify the properties where they could put their ADUs.
That'd be amazing.
Right.
We one of our heroes is a guy named Dan Perolik, and he kind of coined the term, or he didn't he invented the term missing middle housing. And missing middle housing is an approach to residential construction that takes into account not just affordability, or what he calls obtainability, and feasibility, which is what will fit on the site, but also livability. And so he's thinking about the fabric and the character of the neighborhoods in which these homes are being designed and built within.
So is there a school? Is there a park?
It's
all
more
these
so
factors?
looking at the individual unit by unit level, or project by project level. For example, instead of pushing homes to the rear of lots, which ADUs often do, how do we bring those homes to the very front? And do we have to create more density along the street where people, sort of walk to work, and where, kids bike and cars drive, and all of this activity? I'm doing this a lot, but that's a street. But it's, there's a real, it's not just about, can I build an ADU here, or, what is possible, but it's like, what is the form and shape and design of what's possible? And so we really believe in missing middle housing as a way to not only increase the density of communities, but to increase their livability. And backyard homes fit into that in some ways, but in other ways we really need to think bigger.
In a more literal sense, if you have been to a place like Cambridge, Massachusetts, or parts of Chicago outside of this kind of the densest part of the city, if you walk down what most people would picture to be like a beautiful residential street, if you pay close attention, most of those buildings aren't actually single-family homes. They might be the scale of a single-family home. They might look, sort of American house-like. Yeah. But typically there's at least 3, maybe 7 or 8 different units in that building. There's going to be 3 front doors and maybe a stairwell. Okay. And there could be, many, many more people living on that parcel of land than you typically would have with a single-family home. And so the really interesting thing about this concept that Dan has been pushing for a really long time is there are ways to build, pleasant, walkable cities that kind of look like the idyllic American city as a lot of people sort of picture it, that allow for many more people to live there in a healthy way, which is how you kind of create a healthy housing market. You have enough units for demand to flex, and you are building a more diverse array of things than just single-family homes. So when you do what Austin has done, or what LA has done in many neighborhoods, is when you have a long history of only letting developers build single-family homes, unless you really radically change the rules, the best you could do is an ADU. The most you could do with a single-family home, if you're a developer, is to put one more tiny home in the backyard. And so it really kind of caps the potential upside of housing supply across really large areas of land. And so this concept of expanding the idea of okay, if I buy, back to your question of if I want to tear down a home, what can I do there? Or what's going to stop me? In a lot of places, the most you can do is just put another single-family home there again, which is that's the root of the problem. Yeah. And cities like Austin are slowly chipping away at all of the different kind of regulatory things that play into that, what can I build here question. And so just allowing it, saying, if all of a sudden, tomorrow, Austin said, on every single property where there's a single-family home today, you can build a quadplex. You can put a 4-unit building that looks like a single-family home. That would be amazing, and it would solve one of maybe a dozen different factors that would stop a developer from actually doing that, because there's the availability of contractors that know how to build projects like that. There's the financial feasibility of it. There's market demand. There's being able to get a loan to build that thing because no one else is doing it. So how do you compare the value for it from a risk analysis standpoint? There's all this crazy complexity that goes beyond just what the rules are. And so that's why this is this very kind of long-term thing that we're engaging with.
So who's stopping this from happening? Why is it so difficult to get done?
I mean, you can simply...
Is it about electing the right people into office, or?
That's part of it.
Yeah. And
City council is really important.
Even if you did have all the right people in place and they were to go in and put the regulation in place that allows you to tear down single-family homes and build quadplexes. It is incredibly difficult to understand at the city scale the economic impact of doing that, right? And no one's studying that.
But it would be positive economic impact.
Perhaps.
No.
Yeah, there was just a great article in The Atlantic about how housing is, right, maybe it was Time. We'll put it in the show notes maybe.
Yeah, that's it.
About how like housing affordability and the lack of housing supply in America is ruining everything else, because one of the biggest impacts you can have on your economic environment is your density, right?
Right.
The kind of concentration of capital. If you look at great American cities, right, these are incredibly economically productive because they're so efficient spatially, right? And it's interesting that relationship, and how obviously it has to be mediated, right? Like not every city is going to be New York. We understand that. And that's again why we kind of love the missing middle approach, because it builds a kind of, I don't want to say this, but like I'll say it, like a European level density, a Berlin level density, which is, before the car was sort of deemed to be kind of imminently walkable.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a centuries tested model, right? But that kind of density can exist in Austin and still preserve the character of this city.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone's thinking about the economic impacts, the walkability, the livability, but like think about the environmental impact, right? Your footprint of having 4 units on a single lot versus just allowing a single family maybe plus an ADU, and then having to cut down more trees to add another lot where you can put 2 more units.
Yeah. I mean, we come to, that's what I wanted to discuss as well, sustainability.
Right.
How do we make real estate construction sustainable? Are we close to making it sustainable? Is it too expensive?
Density is everything.
Density.
Another incredibly complex question.
Yeah.
I would cynically say
Is that the biggest argument for what's stopping more housing?
Well, that California study is always a good reference, right?
The
Berkeley study,
so
or it's like the best thing you can do to reduce carbon emissions is urban infill, residential.
Yeah, it's a super layered question.
Yeah.
I think you're asking more about the means and methods, like what houses are made of and construction practices. Yeah. So what companies like Samara, is it Samara or is it Samara?
Samara.
Okay, so 2 startups. What Samara is doing, the idea of using healthier materials, building things in a factory off-site, assembling them faster. There's tons of studies and proof to show that that's a better way from just a pure carbon emission.
They use solar panels on the roof to power the home.
Yeah, all of it. Every house should be built that way, and it's going to take probably longer than our lifetimes for that to become the norm. Hopefully it does. But what Kyle's referring to is that there's also a kind of, again, like an urban kind of city makeup dimension to the idea of sustainability in construction that has to do more with, again, if you put 4 units on every single family home parcel in a city, the distance that your average citizen drives now probably goes down by 4 in a super rough sense.
Yeah.
And the distance that someone, their children lives to their school now is probably walking distance, and you just cut out 2 back and forth car routes a day. So there's all these kind of second order effects that if you densify the geographic area, the radius that the number of people in a city live, all of essentially the emissions of that entire population dramatically reduces. And so just as important as so the Berkeley study that Kyle's referring to, they looked at kind of the relative order of magnitude effect on carbon emissions based on the kind of area of research or dollars invested in different parts of sustainability strategies. And denser urban environments was 7 or 8 times more effective than electrifying every automobile in the entire country. You could completely eradicate gas cars, and it still wouldn't do as much in terms of moving the needle forward as just building denser cities.
So the major problem then is how do you build the building in a sustainable manner, right? Because building skyscrapers is extremely heavy on the environment.
Yes,
but think about this is something
it's offset once it's built and people start living in it, and then how long does it take to offset the impact of the construction?
But we have to answer these questions sort of qualitatively.
Yeah.
Because even the the smartest people, the experts, disagree on the quantitative ways to calculate embodied carbon. There's no universal standard in the way that you calculate embodied carbon. Operational, is getting a little bit closer in terms of precision and accuracy, but if you just think about it sort of anecdotally, right? Like, you have a residential project that takes up an acre of land, right? And 400 people are able to live there, or, let's say Austin, maybe 100 people are able to live there. Yeah, maybe 150 people. Yeah. Do the calculation in my head. Think about that, the equivalent single family layout, right? Where you have, 50 homes, right, in a subdivision, right? And you have to put that far out outside the city, right, at the exurbs now, because you don't have that much space in the city. Think about the concrete that needs to be, the roadways, all the horizontal infrastructure that needs to be maintained also and needs to be replaced every 5 to 10 years. We look at a multifamily building and we say, wow, that's, obviously much more embodied carbon than, some single family homes. But if you really look at all of the citywide infrastructure that's required to make that work, it's not so clear anymore. It's obvious that multifamily is much more sustainable.
It's a great argument.
It's easy to look at two similar buildings side by side and measure the inputs and outputs. Actually, I won't even say that's easy. It's really difficult to draw the boundary kind of around the diagram of what you measure and don't measure.
Yeah.
But if it's two buildings of the same size in the same area, one's built out of CLT and wood panels and was built in a factory, other one was built in traditional means and methods, probably heating and cooling is more expensive, leaks more air, the materials weren't as sustainable. That's comparatively easy. When you bring, again, like kind of an urban fabric and that into the diagram of the things you're measuring, it gets exponentially more complicated. But the thing, the second part, the way that you lay out the city in the first place, has a many order of magnitude higher effect on, the climate, sustainability, whatever you want to call it.
100%.
And it's not just the housing that you're putting out in the suburb, right? The fact that you're now putting up housing 45 minutes away from downtown Austin, now you have to provide the basic amenities like grocery stores, gyms or hospitals. Again, huge, giant concrete boxes, basically, to help sustain those, suburban living.
All these pipes, like water pipes, electricity,
all the
all this
amenities,
infrastructure
necessities that has to, be provided for those communities.
Yeah, like whoever's measuring the electricity coming out of that house they just built isn't thinking about the fact that they had to build a hospital for that house to be there in the first place. It's a radically more complicated, kind of like diagram to measure.
But do you think that's a distance thing or a population thing? Because I think you need a hospital for every, 100,000 people, something like that. Less.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We're not trying to demonize the suburbs here.
Yeah.
I mean, my parents live in a suburb, and it's always, beautiful and fun to visit them there.
Yeah.
But we are saying that, our generation, generations, sort of the younger generations are moving to cities. It's where they want to live.
Yeah.
Right? That's where the economic opportunity is. It's where the cultural amenities are. It's where it's just fun to live.
Yeah.
Right? And increasingly, as you get older and you have a family, you don't necessarily want to move out to the suburbs. Maybe that's, where you can afford to buy a home at and live.
Would you want to live in the city, like in the city center with family?
Yes. Yeah.
You would?
Yeah. I mean, like, where I don't want to live is, the new kind of term for like the super suburbs is like the exurbs. It's like you've gone so far kind of beyond what used to be the boundary of the suburbs that you're now, this place that you're not even really living in that city anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe like by address you are, but you're so far away from the core, you're in a different place.
Yeah.
That's where I definitely don't want to live.
Yeah.
What about you?
I want a garden.
Okay.
I think, I want to live in a house with a garden. But again, if it was closer to the city center, that would be better than living further away.
And in a city like Austin, most properties here have that. They're detached houses with yards and gardens and all that.
Actually, most houses have pretty large yards here in Austin.
Yeah, we don't, and this often happens where you get into this binary argument where it's like you either live, in the suburbs, the exurbs, where freedom and land are plentiful, or you live in the city where like, you know, you're constrained and, you know, it has this sort of like, you know, somewhat socialist connotation, whatever. And we don't believe in either or, right? We believe in density and we believe in optionality, and that, you know, through density we can create more options for people to live affordably.
And it also comes down to lifestyle, because if you have cities that are walkable, people walk more, right? Austin is not walkable. No one walks here. I actually do walk here. But when
Congress on a Saturday is pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's true. I told my friend yesterday, I walked to East Austin to see a friend. She's like, you walked 50 minutes to East Austin. She couldn't believe it, right? Like, why would you not take Uber or take the bus? So I think the culture is very different from Europe, where everyone walks. Another startup I want to talk about was Boxabl, right? So Boxabl is another tiny home construction startup that gained notoriety after Elon Musk claimed that he lived there at his...
Did he claim that he lived there? Or
I
did
think
they claimed
he claimed he lived there.
And I think he said, looks cool.
I think he said he lives there when he said SpaceX.
Okay.
So SpaceX is in southern Texas.
Brownsville, right?
And when he's working there, he has a house there somewhere on the side. Like, I don't know. And I have some stats here. So they have 160,000 person wait list. But they only built 400 homes in a year. So this is extremely difficult to pull off, right? Like building a home in a factory. What are your thoughts about Boxabl? Are you a fan?
There's a huge, I mean, they kind of just fall in the spectrum of, you know, startups getting into the manufacturing side of the housing crisis. And there's going to be a huge spectrum of things that kind of show up within that. They're going for as cheap as possible, as fast as possible.
Yeah.
So from a sustainability materials standpoint, again, it's easy to make a lot of claims about the sustainability of a thing when you just measure it by speed. But there's also material inputs, there's also the longevity of the thing, there's the flexibility of the thing. So they're going for as fast as cheap as possible, which a lot of people are going to be interested in. Longer term, I don't think that's a concept that probably, you know, is going to age super well. You know, the idea of just this, you know, incredibly cheaply made put together box that it's temporary housing, essentially. It's built the same way the military would build.
Yeah.
You know.
How long does it last?
That's a hard question about construction in general. I would wager not as long as you say that.
Yeah,
like
what does
10
Boxabl say?
No idea.
Yeah.
But like, imagine in Texas where you have, like, or in places where you have extreme weather conditions like tornadoes, hurricanes. I don't think Boxabl would work, really.
Yeah, we won't comment.
Okay,
on the
you won't
viability.
comment on Boxabl.
Again, I think like it goes back to our comments around Samara. You know, and again, we find Samara to be a beautiful product, but it's only one option. Yeah. Among many in the city's built environment, and then again, as the city rolls out and updates the zoning code, rolls out incentives and bonuses to the density code, and the zoning code, and it's updated over time. You know, we need a lot of different ways in which we can densify and build.
We were talking about this before we started recording, right? You asked if are we going into another recession from a housing standpoint, right? And does this look similar to 2008? And I think the common answer that we hear, and I think we all know now, is, you know, it's not the same problem as 2008. 2008 was a supply problem. There's excess supply in the market, not enough demand, versus now there's a pretty high demand and not enough supply, and affordability kind of plugs into this.
We kind of stopped building after 2008. Right?
Yeah, essentially. And we haven't reached a point yet, or the rate of building new homes yet, to the pre-2008 levels to meet the existing demand. So I don't think there is a one size fits all or one solution fits all. So I don't even know if like these startups that are coming up with these prefabricated homes are competing with each other necessarily, just because of the amount of demand in the space. And their ability to produce to meet that demand. But yeah, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of respect for any of these startups that are addressing this prefabricated market, because in America I feel like there's a negative connotation to these modular prefabricated homes.
When people hear manufactured home, they think mobile home. They think a trailer, which is a super general issue within manufactured construction that essentially every startup in that space kind of grapples with.
A lot of people live in trailers, right? Like
so
in
here's
rural.
a great example of planning, right? Like we talk about a trailer home as a type, right, as a typology, but we never talk about where trailer homes are located, right? They're usually located, they're pushed outside the city, right? And these people who live there are often lower income,
yes.
right? And so when they're pushed farther outside the city because they're, deemed undesirable from a land value perspective, they have less access to education, to services, to school for their children, these sorts of things. And so, there is a planning aspect to this in the way that we think about affordability that, we need to think about within the city where there are these opportunities.
But how do you make living in the city affordable then?
You build more housing.
You build more houses.
And you really...
Well, you need some subsidies for these people who,
And that's what affordable
are
housing
lower
is
income.
Essentially. So when almost every major city has some kind of developer incentive for building affordable housing, it doesn't ever get utilized as much as cities hope that it would. But in general, the idea is that it relaxes the constraints on what you can build by making a promise or a guarantee that some percentage of the housing you build will be guaranteed affordable for some period of time.
Yeah, that's how it works in London.
40 or 100 years.
Yes.
It is usually difficult to get that kind of property development to pencil out relative to just building. This is why you see so much luxury housing in every city. It's just less risky and faster to just build the most expensive thing targeted for the most expensive market and kind of push the problem downstream. But in general, if you build denser, one of the mechanisms that's supposed to be working is with affordable housing incentives, and it's still kind of a puzzle that hasn't been totally unlocked in most cities.
Mm-hmm.
And as a developer, if you've been building these luxury homes for 15, 20 years, and that's what your bread and butter is, you kind of want to just stick to that because your numbers will pencil out in the end.
Yeah.
And even if these incentives exist, as Nate's describing, developers are they're not as willing to take these risks to steer out of their lane. And I think this is where Cedar plugs in and helps them understand what their options are and how they can pencil them out.
That's amazing. That's awesome. So we live in a pretty difficult times economically. If I have significant resources, would you recommend that I buy a house? Would you recommend that I rent?
We can't provide investment advice.
Unofficial.
We would recommend you become a real estate developer, a residential real estate developer.
Okay.
So whatever that means to you.
A lot of people are buying apartments here in Austin. People who live outside of Austin, outside of Texas, and they're renting it out because so many people are moving here. People who work for Google, Facebook, Tesla, Apple, all these large companies, and they have large incomes. So it's
there's a lot of residential speculation as well.
In a super high level sense, like in the United States, there's tons and tons of research that shows that property ownership is a vehicle towards long-term wealth. So if your parents are wealthy or your grandparents are wealthy, it's likely that they owned property. And this is a super high level kind of sociological issue. There's lots of kind of racial background. Like it's the percentage possibility of owning a home today is very, very tied to your ethnicity, and it always has been because there's lots of segregationist policies around home ownership. So in a general sense, like should I buy a home? If you have the resources to do so, the market or kind of economically the U.S. is designed to incentivize you to do so. But there's also a lot of downsides that come with it, and so a lot of people that...
Texas has pretty high property taxes.
Because there's no income
because
taxes.
There's no income tax.
Yes, and so that is a factor. And essentially in every city, there are downsides to owning a home that people don't really factor in. They think I'm going to be rich if I buy a house. I'm going to have this thing that I can use as collateral for a loan in the future. There's all these things you can do if you have property as collateral. The downside is you also have much higher overhead. You also have to fix your own pipes. It's not your responsibility. There's kind of no one else to take care of issues for you. And so there's also a lot of people that like the benefits of renting. And it's also really common in other parts of the world to be a lifetime renter. If you live in London or Barcelona or essentially any major European city, it's not very common to be a property owner. It's just this kind of assumed thing that you pay.
And it's pretty common to share housing. Even in your late 30s, there are still people who share flats because it's so expensive.
I think we live in a very different time now, so it comes down to personal preference.
Yeah.
You're no longer, in most cases, I would say, are required to stay in one place for a long term, and you can get up and move and especially with these younger generations. So I think, vary from what are you buying a house for? Is it for personal use, or is it just for investment opportunity?
How long will you be living here? I see.
Me?
Yeah.
Forever.
All right. Well, then buy something.
I will. So another thing I wanted to cover is pricing. How do you go about pricing Cedar? Have you launched officially, or are you still in beta?
How do you go around pricing Cedar?
We keep getting this question over and over and over again. I mean, it's a good question to get.
But from who? Who is asking you?
From potential customers.
Okay.
We got this question a lot. Yesterday we presented to the Home Builders Association.
And investors and us asking each other.
Which means there's demand. I mean, again, we're not... we are in some ways creating a market, right? We're creating access to data and to development and design knowledge, right? Which has very traditional ways of being accessed, right? You would have to call a lot of people. You would have to, sort of put all this disparate information together to try and understand on paper what was possible. And we're putting all of that in one place in a digital platform that's, self-serve. It's accessible by you. So that's a new product, right? And new products are hard to price, especially in an industry where everything is relationship based, and there are kind of very traditional transactions and regulatory hurdles that you're working backwards from. Sorry, we're not answering your question, but right now we're learning from customers. We're learning how their businesses work, and how they operate on a project by project scale and how they operate across projects. So as we learn more, we'll refine a pricing model. We're a startup, so subscription model is kind of the default.
Good answer.
And, there is some element to that with kind of add-ons as you get more sophisticated in what you're designing. But we'll also say anyone can log in, if it's okay to plug. Anyone can log into cedar.build right now. You can create an account, access a portfolio, you can start saving projects, you could start looking at any site in the city.
At your own house, right? You can figure out if you can build a property in your backyard.
Go check out and see if you can build an ADU in your backyard, or not backyard, but on your site.
Or add on.
Or add on.
Your house might not be developed to the true development potential, so you can...
Right.
Sorry, interrupt.
No. I mean, but yeah, please.
Add-on is an attached addition
to
your house.
Build out further. Let's say your property allows you to build out to 2,000 square foot, house,
or add another floor.
Yeah, but your current house is only 1,500. You could add another 500.
Right.
But I'm going to repeat what Kyle just said, but with a question. I think as an early stage startup, the question for us is, we are asking this ourselves, which is more of an existential question, which is, what is more important to us right now is to get paid and have customers paying us, or get enough feedback from customers so we can build a product that truly delivers value to our customers, and we can scale beyond Austin and, again, provide the value that the customer really needs and the utility that the platform should provide. And putting a heavy price on the product right now at this stage kind of becomes a barrier, especially as Kyle's describing, like, this industry is so relationship based, and the industry's used to interacting with a human to get these answers that we're providing. And when you put the tech aspect of it in front of them and then charge something similar to what they're used to paying a human for a service based approach, it's hard to kind of, again, get customers to interact with it and provide the feedback that we need in the way that we hope to get, again, if we put that price on there.
I mean, the nice thing about being an early stage startup and having great investors, as we do, is you have some space to really, again, figure out how the market works and how you're going to work in the market. And just to clarify, I think we've all kind of said, we're replacing humans and transactions, and we're not completely doing that. But we are finding a gap in the market where, there are misaligned incentives, and where you may want to work with an architect or a civil engineer a little bit later in the process when you actually get into building permitting. We're kind of filling a gap where it doesn't make a lot of sense to engage with these design professionals until you're really ready to start constructing the project.
But you are replacing scouts.
Permitting the project.
Right. You're replacing scouts. So have you faced any backlash from them?
we're not really replacing scouts or
I mean, the way deal flow works right now is, it's all humans, right, involved. You have brokers sending you deals either through mail or email, or these scouts, as we were discussing earlier, going out and looking at these sites and literally knocking on people's door, asking them if they want to sell their property. We're just another channel to help them source those deals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The way we put it yesterday was, you have inbound and you have outbound, which is what Rahul was describing. And then Cedar's adding a third layer to site search, which is search.
Mm-hmm.
And, with all the data that we're putting in one place, it becomes very easy to, to really filter lots and properties in the city that make sense for your development thesis. And so then, once you've kind of narrowed and filtered to properties that make sense for you, then you can engage in traditional inbound, outbound, to close that deal.
Yeah. Who would you say is your main competitor?
We always get this question. We always screw it up.
Is it another startup or is it an established?
There are other startups out there. What's unique about us is that we're working backwards from the zoning code. And I know that sounds like a detail, but when we talk to developers, right, their first regulatory hurdle is what are all the things that exist on site and exist within the zoning code that are going to limit, constrain, or maybe invalidate what I want to build on this site. So, we're zoning code centric, and we're bringing the latest data from the zoning code to developers.
Mm-hmm.
And there aren't any startups that we've really seen do that effectively in the same environment where you're also provided with design options.
Yep.
So, again, that early stage design and kind of iteration process, you're getting the latest data from the zoning code so that the projects that you're proposing work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For the kinds of companies the kinds of developers that build projects like, the ones around here, really large, multi-story, highly dense housing complexes, like there's a lot of competitors in that space because there's a lot of money in the enterprise scale development. Essentially, there really aren't very many startups like us focusing on the smaller kind of mid-market, even 2 to 3 person companies that are much more bespoke operations. So, but to us it's more interesting because, again, when you look at a map of a city like Austin, that's most of what the urban fabric is.
Yeah.
At the really, really large scale, everyone's competing for these really high margin, really high dollar, development opportunities, and the rest of the city, doesn't experience that. But there's going to be, we think, a much higher priority on finding ways to, kind of redevelop and enhance the existing, the rest of the city. The rest of the people don't really think about it that much.
How are you thinking about expanding to other cities?
When we're ready.
Very carefully.
Because you said Austin is, from a regulation perspective, very similar to other cities in the US, right? As opposed to Californian cities, which are regulated heavily.
Austin by far is one of the toughest places to build in the country. In fact, we've talked to one of the best city planners in the country, and he tries to stay away from Austin because of how difficult it is to work around the zoning regulations. And the new council that's coming in is working towards making those things easier.
Shout out Greg Anderson.
Yeah, shout out to Greg Anderson and others. But I think the expansion will be very, it'll be carefully and meticulously done. Starting off with picking cities that are similar to Austin. Definitely not Houston, because there is no zoning regulation. Anyone can go build whatever they want. But maybe, who knows?
Yeah.
This is I know every time you ask a question here, we go and give you, we go into a historical context, but,
I love it.
This is where history is really important as well, because you
Yeah.
have to look at, which cities have been built when in the United States to really understand where it makes sense for us to scale. And, New York, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, these very, the oldest cities in the United States, they have layered and densified over, a few hundred years more than, we'll say, Austin, Dallas, Houston, LA. And, over time, a city sort of naturally equilibrates itself, right? And we definitely want to work with those cities, and we've talked to customers in those cities. But where zoning code really has the most complexity in terms of translating into actual development are the cities that were built really in the post-war period, where single-family zoning really had the biggest impact. And so those are the cities that we want to focus on in the first few years here. And again, that's Austin, San Antonio, Dallas. We won't say Houston because Houston doesn't have any zoning code. California, Oregon, cities in there. Arizona, Phoenix is a major city. It's incredible how much Phoenix has grown, and it's grown on single-family bones.
Denver, Colorado.
Denver,
Nashville, Atlanta.
Nashville is an incredible city for us.
Cities where we won't expand to in the near term are cities where the demand for housing is not as much, or the influx of population moving there, like Des Moines, Iowa, right? Or cities where the zoning regulation is so easy that anyone can build whatever they want, like as Houston or whatever the next city might be. I don't know if there's a perfect answer to this. In the near term, we're extremely focused on Austin. We want to solve the problem here and then really, again, validate the value that we're providing to our customers before we even start thinking about the expansion.
I had Colin from One Decision on a couple weeks ago, and he's also building a search engine, not for real estate, but for parents, right? And I have like 5 other friends that are building search engines for various use cases, like workspace, developers, and so on. Why do you think there is such a boom in new search platforms? Is it because information is getting more complex? There is a huge influx of information coming in. People can't make sense of it.
It's both.
Both.
Yeah, information is in some cases a lot cheaper and kind of cleaner. So like in the last 5 to 10 years, it's been possible to get nationwide data sets of every property that you could possibly imagine in the United States for not that much money. They're expensive, but they're like excessively expensive to a business.
Is there anything that's not digital?
There's tons.
There's tons.
Things like
property deeds.
Things like private homeowners associations. And like in our world, there's lots of data that is very messy and hard to get at, kind of en masse. But there's still a lot of data, and this is what our platform is built on, that is easy to get at. In many cases, it's because cities, because they're small governments, are required by the federal government to publish that information. It's illegal essentially to use data to enforce rules on the public that the public don't have access to. It's creates a weird dynamic. So they legally have to publish that information online. They don't have to make it useful to the people that might need it. So that's where we come in. But beyond that, the other part of your question is like, is it because of the complexity essentially? And that, yes, that's the other big factor. Because essentially the changes to the zoning code, building regulations, all that stuff, they're functionally laws. They don't when they change, there's no expiration date. And so, you're looking at the interaction between rules that were set in 1950 and rules that changed last week.
That's crazy.
And so there's no detangling of that. Actually, Austin tried and sadly failed to completely hit the reset button. And it's just an
Who stopped it?
The public, weirdly enough.
Public.
Organized factions within the public.
Yeah.
And this is where this is where representative democracy and democracy are different, right? There's groups of people who, have a louder voice, we'll say.
And don't want to see things change. There's people that benefit from it being hard to move here. And there's people that like that it's hard to move here. And really anywhere. If I'm already a property owner and I'm benefiting from the fact that my property, goes up 40% year over year in value, I'm probably pretty cool with the fact that millennials can't move to my neighborhood. Obviously, we don't agree with that, and so that's why we're doing what we're doing. But it's that complexity that we think is growing at a even beyond linear rate. It's going to essentially, as cities try to change to solve some of the parts of housing crisis situations that can happen overnight, it's not going to make it easier for people that actually build housing to change their behavior. Like if all of a sudden I can do 10 different things on a property that I've typically always done the same thing, I'm not going to probably change my business overnight. I'm not going to go ahead and start building, quadplexes where I used to just put luxury single family homes. So that's the hard part. Is like how do how do you create that bridge between things that are not changing very fast in a super complex environment, and then kind of focus it down and translate it to the group of people that actually need to be understanding that information.
Yeah. And there are also a lot of old Austin residents, right, who don't want Austin to be a large city full of tech and people moving from more liberal states, right? So there's
this is where we have to be careful, right? Because, that's a philosophy and they have a voice that needs to be heard, right? And we should not delegitimate that voice by any means. But, democracy is about, a group of people deciding collectively where we're going to go as a civilization. And so
rule of the people.
Yeah. Yay. For a different podcast, but oftentimes like that, those opinions have to be translated into parcel by parcel land use requirements.
Yeah,
that's part of the complexity in California that we didn't get into before, is that it only takes a handful of grumpy anti-housing folks to derail something that has a lot of money.
We just said we weren't going to delegitimate that.
No, what I was saying is that it's a funny power dynamic. It's, you could have hundreds of millions of dollars behind a multi-family housing complex, and it's still going to go in front of city council, and a couple of people who just don't like road noise could legitimately derail projects like that. So that's one of the huge complex factors behind building denser housing that developers deal with, essentially in every single project if you work at a certain scale.
Yeah.
Those are social and political issues that we will never, Cedar will never be able to solve. We joke around with some, potential customers or developers here in town, and the way they solve the problems is taking these neighborhood organizations or these the heads of these organizations out to lunch and trying to convey them, this is good for your community and whatnot. And there are other nuances that there's no way any form of tech will solve.
Yeah. Speaking of, sorry.
Well, one of the great things about Austin is that in Texas in general, economic empowerment is really important here. And, that needs to be considered in city planning, and I think it is being considered.
Yeah. I just wanted to say a story. Speaking of old grumpy people, I had a neighbor in London, and he would ring the bell of my door every day at 10 p.m. if I didn't have my lights off. He was like, your light is reflecting in my window. You're not allowed to do that. I'm going to sue you. Yeah. Crazy. What do you do with these people?
Yeah.
Can't do much.
Yeah, it's funny when you, I didn't grow up in the city, but I've lived in the city for the last, over a decade of my life. And you just get used to, a whole different level of interaction with human beings. Nothing really seems crazy to you anymore,
True.
You just sort of, learn to roll with it.
Yeah.
True. So we met last summer when we were doing a startup incubator called Antler. I would love to get your thoughts on startup incubation in general. Why did you decide to go with Antler, not another incubator? What was your experience?
It was pretty organic. We were referred to Antler by a friend of mine, Gabe Ben Simon, who was a previous Antler invested company, and he had a great experience. And we looked around. There's tons of these programs out there now, and it's honestly, it's kind of.
Did you choose Austin before Antler?
Austin, it was actually also just kind of organic.
The stars all aligned
at once.
So Rahul was living here.
This happened to be one of the places that Antler just has a U.S. office. The timing worked for the Antler, cohort in Austin, kind of for where we were and starting the company, and so the stars just aligned.
And broadly, when we pitched the idea, we're trying to solve the housing crisis. That's a big problem to solve. We're trying to solve a very small portion of that problem. One of the partners that we interviewed with, if you will, was actually looking for housing, looking to buy a house, and the lack of housing options immediately resonated with her, which I guess kind of helped our case in getting into the program.
Yeah, most of the Antler team had relatively recently relocated to Austin, essentially to run the accelerator.
Oh, they did.
So they were feeling, they were kind of feeling the pain of the problem that we were talking about. And I guess we were already we were pretty certain that Austin would be the place, regardless of where we did an incubator program. And it was also still the time where most of them were remote. And so this was, I guess we're talking about probably March of 2022. And so we were kind of entertaining hybrid scenarios, and with Austin, we would have ended up here regardless. And so the fact that Antler was having a mostly in-person program in Austin, it just all kind of came together.
Mm-hmm. And Austin is just a great place to build a business. It just has that ecosystem. but to support you build a business.
And Antler's a little bit different in that, and sort of Tyler and Perna kind of, shout out to them. They're really who got us there and then funded us, right? Advocated for us amongst a broader team. You know them well.
I do.
They really put themselves forward as company builders and entrepreneurs first. There's a lot of, let's say, like culture. Startups are a cultural phenomena, right? Yeah. And there's been a ton of media and hype around them, and that really, that it's a capital market, right? And so mania and hype, drives sort of a boom bust cycle, right? And what we really liked about Antler is that it was really focused on the fundamentals, focused on company building, and focused on solving real problems. Not to say that other accelerators aren't, but we just kind of loved how serious Antler was around finding real problems that real people have and solving them.
Sorry, I think your question was, what are our thoughts on accelerators and incubators?
Well, I think that was my answer. So
yeah. I mean, I think like it just depends on what stage of building the company that you're in, right?
So when you came in, did you have anything, or did you just have an idea, a rough idea?
We had a very different idea.
Different
and in
idea.
Fact, built version of that product. I don't know, maybe if you want to jump in.
Well, I guess actually where we started, and the thing that actually aligned the most closely with like where we were all kind of sitting professionally before we started Cedar was actually a lot closer to a company like Samara. We were really interested in needs and methods, materials, sustainability, construction, how do you productize housing. And the three of us are all first-time founders, and we spent a lot of time kind of iterating on that idea and talking to people. And once we started to build relationships with folks in the development and construction industry here, it was really clear that there was this whole other set of problems that exist before you even are thinking about what you're going to build that essentially turned into what Cedar is today. So we pivoted pretty quickly. And that was also really due to the influence that Antler had on us. We were, coming out of enterprise software and architecture, and we had a lot of like very large, very ambitious ideas that we had like a pretty serious reality check pretty early on.
Like week 1, week 2. We shifted everything.
We're all technical founders, right? So we had very zero knowledge about ways to go out and get market validation, or even like what kind of steps should we take to get this product that we're building in the dark in front of people. And this is where a team like us benefited from being in an accelerator program like Antler. And then also, like, when you're in an accelerator program, there's a sense of urgency because you know when that program ends. So you have to be kind of deliberate about every step that you take during that time frame.
No, I have to say you were one of the most hardworking groups of the Antler cohort. You were pulling all-nighters every day. No, you were. You were always in the office late. So that's good work ethic.
Thank you.
So you're 3 co-founders. Can you talk about, you were friends before you entered Antler, so you know each other well, you trust each other. Have you had any co-founder issues? Has anything come up? Can you talk about it?
I think we're pretty good.
Do you have any lessons for my audience?
I keep waiting for a big blow up, but we haven't had one yet.
We'll have conflicts about, like little, if sometimes it's very little, with like, okay, maybe it's technical about something about the product or the next step with the customer or even fundraising. But I think in the long term, or at least where we are today, we wouldn't be here if we didn't have those conflicts and if we were hesitant about voicing our individual opinions.
Do you have an equal voice? Because 3 co-founders, it's very easy to make a decision.
We were constantly talking over each other, and I think people on the other end, like you, must get a little bit annoyed by that.
No.
But
we all have 1.5 voices.
But we're all like, we're all passionate about the same thing. We all have very similar perspectives and viewpoints. Maybe not life perspectives, but perspectives on the right way to go about solving a problem. We're all hustlers,
I think like this might be kind of a weird answer, but like the shared experience we all had that keeps us on a super even collaborative playing field is that we all went to architecture school together, which I guess I can only speak to an architecture school in the States, but it's kind of about designing buildings, but it's also about learning how to present things and receive critical feedback. And it's honestly like architecture school in a lot of ways is like the best preparation to like learn how to pitch things, which I've always found really fascinating, is because you get at least relative to like other undergrad degrees or like kind of traditional, college educations, like there's a huge focus on like deadlines, deliverables, and then like pitching to a group of people who are going to tell you what they hate about it. And that's the only way to get better. And so we've all had this like kind of like crash course in like functional discourse in a way, and we all have really thick skin for it. And so we can get right to the core of what we don't like about the thing, or like if it's product or if it's an idea or if it's a potential, like literally anything about the company. We just kind of translated that ethos kind of naturally just to how we run Cedar, and that's been super helpful.
We also tend to get into the details a bit too much, which I know you're probably like
no, I'm happy to listen.
About, but
critical feedback is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, if we were operating under one dominant thought of mind, I don't think like we would have the option to course correct whenever we need to. And we have, like, as we mentioned, we came in with a different idea when we first came to Antler, and we've not pivoted but course corrected a few times.
I just want to say pivots are completely normal.
Yeah.
Most people don't think that they are, but every company that I have spoken with from Antler has pivoted. And it's just a normal part of the startup journey. Yeah. And a lot of people give up when their first idea doesn't work out and they don't figure out how to move forward. So do pivot and don't give up. So what do you have any advice to aspiring founders, to people who are in the same boat, like anything you want to tell my audience?
Solve big problems. It's not easy, but like you were saying, you just have to keep at it.
I always like hesitate to give advice, but I can like say what's worked personally, and Cedar's still very early, so who knows whether we'll make it, but we haven't made it yet, so take that for what it is and what it's worth. But I think for all of us, what was really great about when we decided to build Cedar is that we had some time in industry. We actually worked on software, built buildings, designed projects around the world, and really saw where the pain points were. And we developed an intense passion for those after lots of failures from one side of solving those problems, from the architectural side or from the software engineering side. But, I think we all, we sort of pivot around who the right customer profile is, or, who we're going to collaborate with, or what the business model is. But at the end of the day, like, we know how to write software, and we know how to design and get buildings built. And we're going to figure out the rest, right, based on some pretty strong fundamentals. And maybe not every problem needs that level of kind of background in sort of prep, but for us, it definitely did. Yeah. And so I would just say, like, don't think that you need to go build a startup tomorrow. Like, go work in industry, figure out how things work, and then, if you are so entrepreneurially inclined and you see a big enough problem, go after it. Don't hesitate to do that.
And as Mark Andreessen calls it, I think what you're describing is have some degree of domain expertise. So it just makes it easier, right? When you're trying to build a business, talking to your customers, talking to investors, if you can prove that you are an expert in this field. Like, if we were to try and build a biotech company tomorrow, no one would, even give us 5 minutes to listen to our idea.
Yeah, cool. So what do you want people to know about Cedar? How can they sign up? Any last words?
Yeah, I mean,
cedar.build.
Is
That's
where
the
you can
website.
go sign up right now. It's completely free. We are, again, as we've been discussing, Austin focused, but you can still go in there and leave feedback. If you want your city to be the next city that we expand to, you can definitely leave that in the feedback section. Guys, want to add to that?
I mean, I think beyond that, it's just we're building and figuring things out as we go. That's like super core to how we operate, is that
building in public too.
Building in public, doing it in the open.
Building and failing in public.
For real. Yeah, I mean, that's like, we think that's a super important to doing what we're doing. I think a lot of companies in the startup space they hold what they're building, they hold their ideas way too close to their chest. They're afraid that someone's going to steal my idea. Yeah. And the reality is that no one cares about your idea. And it's like, it's such a hard thing to hear, and it's a hard thing for us to hear for a long time, but it's very common ethos in the startup world. Like, ideas are worth functionally nothing. And so we kind of flipped our perspective on that really quickly and decided we're just going to launch the first thing that like doesn't crash. And then we're going to ask people for feedback on it every day, and then see how fast we can make it better. And so,
and Nate's a great engineer, like an amazing engineer. So the first thing didn't crash, came pretty early. So
yeah, it crashes less often than it used to, which is cool.
Customers more so than investors will give you, the 100% honest feedback. When you pitch the idea to a customer, their expectation is this is fully functioning. Everything that comes out of it is correct to the T. So, they'll tell you exactly, everything that's wrong with the platform, which is incredibly valuable for us to learn and continue to improve.
No, I think you're an awesome team. You have strong fundamentals, and I'm sure that you will build the next unicorn. So I'm cheering for you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you for having us.